Yeah.
Should we just start?
I say go for it.
All right. Hi, guys. My name is Corey Blaustein. I work at Triangle Artworks, and I'd like to welcome you to this amazing webinar provided through amazing technologies, so we're all safe and healthy and learning still. If you guys don't know what Triangle Artworks is, it's an organization to help provide artists and art organizations the professional development skills to become successful in their art ventures. We also do advocacy on behalf of the arts sector in the Triangle area and in North Carolina in general as well. So this is a part of our professional development programming, which we call ArtSwell. Part of ArtSwell are these webinars. Another part is an online resource, which you can check out at ArtSwell TV on YouTube. This webinar will be available there as well for free if you want to share it or go back over it if you missed anything. So how things are going to work. So all of the attendees are bases. There should be an option for questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please enter it in there, and we will answer those questions throughout the time. And that is really all of the ground rules and everything that we have currently. This is our second webinar, so please bear with us and figuring out the logistics and everything. But I want to introduce Lauren Van Hemert, who is an amazing person. She is the host of RDU on Stage podcast, which is available on all streaming platforms where podcasts are available, right, Lauren?
Everywhere, yep. Everywhere podcasts are heard. And
awesome.
Alexa, which
awesome. She has a journalism background and provides great opportunities for storytelling, and she is going to lead us through how we can use podcasting as a great medium for storytelling and promoting the work you do. As well, right below me is Cynthia Dice, who is also a part of Triangle Artworks. We will be helping Lauren out by building questions and helping on the technical side of things. But now I will turn it over to Lauren, and Lauren, take it away.
Great. So Corey, we did have a question. Lizette wanted to know if we could make this full screen. So I think we can, right? For her or for the participants, if they can full screen. So we'll work on it for you, Lizette. Like Corey said, I'm Lauren Van Hemert, and I am the host of the RDU on Stage podcast, and my background, although I was a visual artist for many years, and I still once an artist, always an artist. So I still consider myself an artist, but I really am focused on journalism. And I went to school to be a journalist. I graduated from Indiana University's School of Journalism. Started in radio when I was about 16 years old. And what's interesting about the podcast now is it's very similar to the little talk show I had when I was 16 years old. So I really do like the podcast medium, the podcast platform, and I'm excited to share a ton of information with you. And I've kind of divided this presentation into chunks. So as we go through, especially once we get into kind of the more techie parts, I'll stop and I'll ask Corey if there's any questions, and I'll be happy to address those as we go along. Podcasting is growing by leaps and bounds. I am going to share my screen with all of you so you can see the slideshow as we go along. The website where you can find my podcast and you can find more information if you're a
Lauren,
web person.
can I just stop you?
Okay.
For 1 second. Are we all able to see Lauren's presentation? Can you say, okay, we've got one saying no, yes. Looks like we are all there. Okay.
So good. All right. So podcasting is huge. We're approaching 1 million valid podcasts, according to the Audacity podcast stats page. It's a huge field, and these 979,000 valid podcasts are the ones that are listed in the Apple directory. We'll talk about Apple and iTunes. Now it's called Apple Podcasts, used to be called iTunes. We'll talk about that directory and Spotify and other directories towards the end, but this is a booming field. I mean, these numbers have increased. The last time I looked at these statistics, it was like 800,000 podcasts, and that was back in December. So you can see that this is a growing field that everyone's trying to jump in on. As far as North Carolina goes, we are the 6th largest podcast market in the United States, according to WRAL. There are several well-known established podcasts being produced here. Criminal is being produced in Chapel Hill, and they are an award-winning, very popular podcast. Some of you may know the Art Curious podcast, and a lot of people didn't know that this is done right here in Raleigh. And she does have events. We'll talk about using events to promote your podcast, but I know she's done events through the Alamo Drafthouse. One of my favorite podcast is the Artist Soapbox. My friend and current Piedmont laureate Tamara Kassane, she's doing amazing things on the Artist Soapbox. And then of course RDU on Stage. So I hope you will listen to all of these wonderful local podcasts, and there are plenty more, but these are just a few I wanted to point out to you. Before we jump in, I think most people know what a podcast is, but when I originally gave this presentation last fall to a group of theater critics, some of them did not know what a podcast is. A podcast is basically a digital audio file, usually part of a series, and it can be downloaded from pretty much the internet to a media player or to a computer. If you have an iPhone, if you have an iPhone, you've seen the Listen Now screen that I have here. I took that screenshot today. That's my podcast library on Apple Podcasts, but it's basically an on-demand program. You can listen to it pretty much anytime, anywhere at your convenience. Stop it, go back to it, pause it. So it's just an on-demand, if you think of it as an on-demand talk show, on-demand radio show. From the visual artist standpoint, when Cynthia Dice and I were originally talking about this, I think if you think of it kind of like your artist statement, like an audio version of your artist statement, that's a really good way to think of it. So before you start your podcast, there are some planning things you're going to want to think about before you just jump in, and it will make your life a whole lot easier. One thing you need to think about, first of all, with podcasting, consistency is key. So your episode length and the frequency in which you drop your podcast in the directories, that's going to have to be fairly consistent. So I have a weekly podcast. It is generally 20 to 30 minutes every single week. It generally drops on Sundays, and that's how you build an audience. You got to be consistent. You got to be consistent with your time. There are podcasts that last much longer than mine, that last hours long, 1 hour, 2 hours. I made mine 30 minutes or less because that seemed to be what people's commute times were, and a lot of my listeners listen in their car. So episode length, the frequency in which you're going to produce your podcast, and the type of show that you're going to have. Are you going to have a solo show? Is it just going to be you speaking? Are you going to have an interview format? Are you going to have a roundtable discussion? It can be a combination of all of those things, but you want to kind of think about the type of show you want, because that's going to determine what type of equipment you're going to need to invest in. Naming your podcast. Other podcasters get super mad if you steal their name. And you may not steal their name intentionally. So what I would suggest is, before you jump in and start creating a logo and start creating artwork around your podcast, make sure the name isn't taken. This is a link to the Apple directory. You can look up any podcast in their search feature and see if the name that you want your podcast to be is taken. The third thing in your planning, and originally when I did this presentation, I put this very late in the presentation, but I want you to start thinking about it from the beginning, is your cover art. You will not get listed on any podcast directory if you do not have cover art that fits Apple's specifications. So when you're designing your cover art, which for me is just my logo, I think for Artist Soapbox, she's just using her logo. Some people have fancy cover art, but your specifications for Apple is going to be 1400 by 1400 pixels to 3000 by 3000 pixels. It's basically a square, 72 DPI in JPEG or PNG format, and RGB color space. Most of you are artists. You probably know what all those words mean, unlike the theater critics I talked to last fall. If you don't know what any of that means, there are places you can go to hire somebody to make your cover art for you. There's a wonderful resource online, Fiverr, Fiverr, and Fiverr. There's tons of artists there who will design your cover art for you. I also want you to think about, before you start, the legalities of podcasting. Just because, I should say this, as a podcaster, we don't have to get licensed or certified in any way to begin broadcasting. So it's not like a radio broadcaster where you have to put in a certain amount of hours and then you get certification, you get licensed to be on the air. Podcasting, you don't need any kind of license or certification, but you still do fall under certain laws, particularly copyright laws, where most podcasters get into legal trouble is with the use of music. If you are a music artist and you are writing your own music, I know Alice Osborne's on here with us. If you are writing and composing your own music, if you're writing and composing your own poetry, your own plays, those you can use on your podcast, no problem. It's when you want to do a cover song of someone else's work, or you want to use your favorite song from the radio, that you run into issues. I would suggest when you are looking to use music on your podcast that you refer to Creative Commons music, any type of royalty-free music. You can Google that. Music that's found in the public domain or original music, that's perfectly acceptable to use. For my podcast, I hired a local artist to do my podcast introduction music. So it's original. He gave me the copyright. So there was no issue there. And that's a really good way to engage your community. Because I have a theater podcast, I'm just going to go back one second. Because I have theater podcast, and occasionally I do want to play theater music. So if I'm covering a musical, I want to play a song from Memphis or play a song from a local production. I do now fall under licensing laws. In order to play any type of copyright music, you are going to need two types of licenses. One is a mechanical license, one is a public performance license. Mechanical license costs usually under $20 for a year, so it's not a very expensive thing to obtain depending on the song. And there's an organization called HFA, the Harry Fox Agency. I think in the last page of your handouts, you have their website. So you would need to purchase a license for whatever song you want to use from them. And then you need a public performance license, and that comes from an organization, typically BMI or ASCAP. Those are the two. When you guys realize how hard it is to use music on your podcast, I promise you, you will be going the copyright-free option. It's very difficult to get permission to use copyrighted music on your podcast. So keep that in mind. Find somebody. Alice Osborne's on here. She writes music. She may be able to do music for you. Hire her to write a beautiful song for your intro or outro. Ariane Mobasher, who some of you may know, he wrote the intro and outro music for mine. So before we get into any questions, I should say, yes, somebody is saying that as a recent BMI employee, the license info is on the website. It's very simple to understand. I will also give a shout out to BMI. I did reach out to them for customer service. So BMI and ASCAP, those are the two big licensing companies. And BMI's customer service was fantastic. I will say this, what I've been told from BMI and what I was kind of told from ASCAP, and this is not written anywhere, so I don't include it as a slide, is a lot of music, how do I explain this? The Apple directory, Apple Podcasts, they have agreements with BMI and ASCAP. If you are only going to play your podcast or list your podcast on Apple, the music selections, copyrighted material you're able to use are going to be wider open to you than if you're going to do it everywhere else. So, for example, BMI owns the rights to the Color Purple soundtrack. if I only drop my podcast on Apple, I can use the Color Purple soundtrack to my heart's desire, and it's covered under the Apple BMI agreement. It's when I want to drop my podcast on Spotify and every other directory, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Pandora now has a podcast directory. That's when you run into these licensing issues. So podcasting is a lot of work, and you want to make your podcast available on as many directories as possible. But if you're just married to Apple, and that's where you only want to list your podcast, then you can use music. That also goes for on the website. So people can go to my website and listen to my podcast. So let's say I want to do the Color Purple music on my podcast, and I'm only dropping it on Apple, but people can also stream it on my website. That violates the Apple BMI contract. So again, now you fall into licensing rules. Any question? I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be. There's entertainment lawyers who do this. Are there any questions so far? And some of your questions will probably get answered later on in this presentation, but I just kind of want to stop here and see if there's any questions yet. Corey or Cynthia, you can let me know if there's any questions at this point.
Yeah, so Kathy asked, can I create my own words and use an established tune?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to say no. There are gray areas when it comes to fair use and parodies and that kind of thing. I would really just say no. When you see as we go forward how long the how much work this is, you're not going to want to get in trouble and have your podcast be taken down. So I would say probably not using any, because if you're using somebody else's music and putting your words, you might be using their recording, and their recording is probably copyrighted. Lizette asked, how long should the music be? It depends on you. My intro music is about 30 seconds long. My outro music is about 30 seconds long. If it's much longer than that for the intro or outro, then people may just get bored really fast. So I would say keep it around 30 seconds. Kathy's saying she would sing the words herself and not use the recorded music. Again, Kathy, I'm not a lawyer, but I know from the podcasts where I've wanted to use music, I still need permission. So for example, I did a podcast where we did Godspell music, and I actually brought my recorder to the theater, and somebody at the theater recorded a version of the song that I was talking about in the podcast, and I still had to get ASCAP license approval to use that. So yes, podcast does fall under digital music. Where the tricky part comes in is people can stream your podcast, which means now we're getting into all sorts of music streaming. Corey and Cynthia, I would recommend to you guys, because this is like a whole podcast unto itself, that maybe you get an entertainment lawyer who could address some of these kinds of issues.
Oh, we are definitely on that, and we'll be trying to get that information out and set up a time.
And BMI and ASCAP, they are very willing to talk to you and answer your questions as well.
Yeah. So Danielle asks if you are doing this under the I can't pronounce that word, auspices of a producer. Say if you're doing the podcast under a nonprofit, and that nonprofit holds a license for a certain material, would that be cool to use?
I'm going to say it depends. And here's where the depends comes in. If you are a theater producer, let's say, and you've acquired the licensing rights to produce Godspell, for lack of a better word, you cannot live stream any part of that performance because that's not typically, that's a separate licensing. So you have to check what permissions your organization has for that particular licensed material. Just because you have the license to something does not necessarily mean you have the streaming or digital right to that material. Maybe that's the way to answer that question.
Just to add on to that, too, usually licensed music, you have to specify the uses of that music, too. And so if your nonprofit or your producer has a license for certain material, but it's only specified within how it can be used, and podcasting is not on that or can't be described from that, it's still not available to be used as well. So just make sure when you look at licensing content to make sure you understand the uses, what you're planning to use that content for. And that also goes into Lizette's question about the reasonable cost. It really depends for the music, the artist, and also the use of it too. And prices can vary depending.
Yeah, I mean, as far as introduction or intro and outro music, I do feel like a reasonable cost. I mean, I've seen folks charge anywhere from $50 to $100 to come up with your intro to outro music. That's that 30-second short piece that is either at the beginning or end of your podcast. Licensing, I will tell you, I do have an ASCAP license because I run into this music question a lot. And my ASCAP license costs me about $250 a year, but under that license agreement, I have access to quite a bit of music. So it really depends on your budget. But when you're just getting, honestly, my recommendation is either use music that's in the public domain or hire somebody to write your music for you and give you permission to use it, and you'll be safe. So I want to talk about equipment because this is the #1 question I get asked all over the place. So let's talk about equipment before you, and this is where, what type of podcast are you going to have? Is it just going to be you talking in your studio and talking about your process, talking about what inspires you, talking about your upcoming craft shows, talking about concerts? If it is just you, your setup, your studio setup, your equipment needs are going to be different than my equipment needs because I'm doing an interview show. So the more people you have involved in your show, the more complex your equipment needs are gonna get. Most people, and you know, now we're gonna talk about the glamorous life of podcasting. Most people podcast out of their closets. Your closet in your house or in your studio probably gives you the best sound because the clothes, you know, it muffles the sound enough. It's kind of like built-in acoustic panels right there in your closet. So a lot of people, when they set up a home studio, they're setting it up in their closet If it's just you and you're setting it up that way, having some sort of moving blankets, pillows, egg crates that can serve kind of as an acoustic panel. If you want to get fancy, you can actually purchase acoustic panels, but you can make do with pretty much items you already have to create the best sound. You're probably going to need a little table. You'll need some sort of audio recorder or a way to record this podcast. And then you're going to need microphone and cables. Again, people are in love with this Blue Yeti microphone. Every single podcaster I've ever met who want to start podcasting, they invest in this. And I guess it's because it's pretty or it's well designed. I don't know why people are in love with this Blue Yeti microphone. If it is just you talking on your podcast, this is a great option. These Blue Yeti microphones are not cheap. If you ever think that you are going to have a second person speaking with you, the Blue Yeti is not a great choice because you both have to be sitting so close to this microphone to generate decent sound that it's going to be very uncomfortable. So if you have more than one person talking at a time, you need more than one microphone. If you're going solo, Blue Yeti, knock yourself out. But do not invest in this puppy if you ever plan on having more than one guest. You'll need some sort of mic sleeve or pop filter. Some people like to mount their microphones to a table. And if you're planning on doing any kind of video recording, some people like to video themselves recording their podcast and post it on YouTube, then you need some sort of tripod. So here are people's closet setups. In the first picture, this guy has a picture of the Golden Girls, which just cracked me up, but you can see he's using the egg crates as his soundproofing. He's got his small table. Headphones are optional if you want them. He does have that furry thing sitting on the table. That is his pop filter. That's going to muffle the sound on his mic. Second guy, the second picture, a little bit more sophisticated. He's got his mic mounted on a boom to the table. And then the third picture, I really like what she's done. She's using pillows to build her acoustic panels. So she's kind of cradling her mic in the center of pillows. She's also demonstrating how close you have to be to your mic to be heard clearly. So I do kind of like all of these pictures just to give you an idea of how glamorous this actually is. So if you're doing a home studio, closet's the best way. And this type of setup is if you're not going anywhere. So you are going to record here every single time you record. You don't need portability. This is kind of the static studio setup. I do not have a static studio setup because I like to go wherever my guests are. So I have an interview show. I have found people are most comfortable in their own space, not my space. If I drag them to my studio, and I don't have a studio, but if I had a studio and I dragged them to some studio where there were big microphones in their face and I made them wear headphones and they were in this booth with me, I may not generate the same type of conversation as I do when they're sitting on the couch in their office or when they're sitting in their space. So when I designed my setup, my equipment needs were so everything could be mobile. My particular setup, I also don't need any type of outlet. Mine runs on batteries, and I'm going to show you my favorite picture of where I recorded one of my episodes in a second. But for your mobile studio setup, generally you need a computer. You need some sort of recording device. It could be your phone. I wouldn't recommend your phone, doesn't give great sound. You can invest in small recorders. I use a Zoom HN6 recorder, and that is pictured in this slide. You want a microphone, again, ideally one microphone per person speaking. So if I have one guest, I have 2 microphones, one for me, one for them. If I have 3, I have about 4 microphones built into my setup, and this little Zoom box can record up to 6 microphones. It has 6 microphone capability. So that's another reason I like this box very much, the HN6. I use Audio Technica microphones. You can use any type of brand you want. I'm not getting paid by the Zoom people, and I'm not getting paid by the Audio Technica people. I'm cheap. So I didn't want to invest a lot in this startup. I didn't know how much I'd be podcasting, and these Audio Technica microphones, they cost around $80 a piece, and they deliver some pretty good sound. You want to have some sort of pop filter or microphone sleeve, the foam piece that you see on the type of my microphone that softens certain sounds, P sounds, S sounds. Headphones are optional, and I would definitely recommend an external hard drive. Audio files are really large and they suck up a lot of space on your computer. So I do have an external hard drive solely dedicated for my podcast audio files. And I've split that into 2 sections, raw audio footage, and then my finished edited podcasts. Because I have this sweet little mobile setup. Here's different places I have recorded. The bottom picture is the Arts Access Studio. Top picture is at Pure Life Theater with Rebecca Fox and Rebecca Artist Jackson of The Rebecca Show. And this is my favorite photo. I did an interview with Paper Hand Puppet Interventions, Donovan Zimmerman, and he wanted to record in this shelter, which is adjacent to his studio in Saxapaw. And at first, when he suggested this, my husband kind of freaked out and said, we can't record a podcast under a picnic shelter, but we can because we don't need an outlet and everything's battery operated. So that's one of my favorite podcasting photos. The other option is you can rent a studio. This is Tamara Kassane. She's our current Piedmont laureate, and she is the host of the Artist Soapbox. She does some of her recording at Shadowbox Studios, which is where this picture was taken. Shadowbox is in Durham, and they pretty much do it. She just shows up, and they do the recording for her. There is another place in Cary, Podcast Cary, which is located at Cary Town Center in the Vibe co-working space. And then there's a brand new podcast studio being built as we speak called Triangle Podcast Studio. They're set to launch this month. That may change because of this virus. But there are spaces around town where you can rent studios and rent equipment if you don't want to invest in equipment. Okay, so Corey, I'm going to ask, this is kind of a good stopping point to see if people have any questions about equipment. So I will.
I actually have a question about equipment. What type of microphone should you get for podcasting if you're just starting?
Good question. The type I have is a Carter. Yes, thank you. That's the type I have. That's what the Audio Technica sounds are, or mics are. It doesn't capture a lot of the surround sound. It just picks up my voice. The Blue Yeti has different settings on it. So it can be an Omni mic where it's just picking up one side of the microphone sound. or it can be both sides of the microphone. It has different settings on it, but I think the cardioid mics are the ones that are generally recommended.
What were the names of those mics again?
The Blue Yeti, if you're in your closet and it's just you talking into a microphone, or even if you're recording music, I know some people record music or poetry, they use the Blue Yeti. So that's the really pretty one that I showed you at the beginning. The ones I use are the Audio Technica mics. They're around $80. The Blue Yeti has a I think the reason people like the Blue Yeti microphones is it has a USB connection, so it connects right into the USB port of your computer. The Audio Technica has two different cables that come with it. One's an XR cable, one is a USB cable, so it can hook up to a recording device or to your computer.
Awesome. And Steve asks, what is the average cost of renting a studio space? Do you have any?
I don't know. I want to say it's around $50 to $100. Well, I want to say some of I just went online earlier today just so I could answer this question. I think the new podcast studio in Raleigh that's being built, they're charging like $50 an hour. Shadowbox, I think it's like $125 for a half a day. They also have audio services you can rent for $50 an hour. It really depends, but I think it's averaging around 50 to 100 ish.
Lizette just shared that Carrie podcast is $100 an hour.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That's good to do. And then Danielle asked what that external hard drive. What is how much space should that be, or does it at this point does it matter?
I don't think it matters. I think the one I have is, I don't even want to quote it because I bought it so long ago. I will let you know. I guess, Corey, I can share that information with you afterwards and you can share it with people. I think mine's like 6 terabytes or 10 terabytes, something like that. But it depends how many episodes and how long your episodes are. I've been using mine for a year and 3 months, and I record an episode every week. Plus I have all my raw footage on there and I haven't run out of space yet. So it really depends. But that external hard drive, I have had my podcast disappear from the Apple directory. I've had it disappear from my podcast host. We're going to talk about the podcast host in a little bit. And it's good to have those backup files because if they disappear, it makes it easy to restore your podcast. Were there other questions, Corey?
There was one other one about software for editing the show. Will you be going over that later?
We're getting there.
Okay.
We're getting there. So just hang tight with me on the editing and I'll answer all those questions in a few minutes.
Perfect. I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, good. So if you are going in the field, even if you're not going in the field, if it's just you recording in your closet, make yourself some sort of equipment or packing list. Because I am going into the field and I'm doing interviews away from home, my packing list includes extra batteries, an extra SD card, microphones, the mic sleeves, if I'm trying to video record while I do my podcast, a tripod. I also invested in a small table that I bought for about $16 from Walmart because it's amazing. Sometimes you get to somebody's office or their house and they want to record on their coffee table, which is low, and they want to sit on the couch. And so they're sitting really far away from the mic. So I've actually included a small portable folding table in my kit. that I take with me to record podcasts. When I first started podcasting, it's pretty unbelievable how much technical stuff you have to think about, especially if you don't have a producer or someone with you helping you record a podcast. So you do want to make a checklist before you start recording. I know this is my checklist, and it is based on experience. So my checklist includes turning my mics on. My mic has a really kind of this little push on and off switch that's really easy to slide down into the off position. So I always want to make sure my mics are on. I want to make sure my SD card is in my recorder. I want to make sure my recorder is on. The very first podcast episode I ever recorded, I was 8 minutes into the recording and realized I hadn't turned the recorder on. You want to silence your cell phone and computer and ask your guests to silence their cell phones and computers. I cannot tell you how many wonderful interviews I've been in and someone's cell phone goes off and we have to re-record, or I have to try to edit that sound out. And I would suggest when you're starting out, use headphones, because whatever you're hearing through the headphones is what's actually being recorded. So the headphones gives you a little bit of checks and balances, but I would not be sharing this list with you if I had not made some of these mistakes. So even though it sounds kind of silly, like, of course I'm going to remember to turn my mics on, when you actually get to 2 minutes before recording your podcast, there's so many things to think about that it's easy to forget any one of these things. I do want to talk a little bit about recording remote interviews, because even if you think you will never record a remote interview, it will happen, I promise you, where someone's going to be in New York and say, hey, you'd make a great podcast guest, but you're in New York and I'm in Raleigh. How are we going to make that happen? There's all sorts of technology to make it happen. Some people do like to record on Skype or their phones. There's better technology out there that will generate better sound. So I would not recommend Skype or your telephone to do recording because it's not going to yield as good a sound as some of these other things. There's software out there. My favorite software online is Zencastr. Zencastr works very similar to Skype or Zoom without the video. You just send somebody a link, they connect to your recording. Zencastr records both of you on a separate track. So I'm recorded on one track, my guest is recorded on a second track, and then I can bring both those tracks into my editing software and edit them separately. So if my guest is speaking really softly and I'm speaking really loudly, I can adjust my guest's sound without messing up my sound. That's why the separate track recording is really ideal. Zencastr has a free version where you can record up to 8 hours a month. I've never exceeded the free version and I've never had to pay them. Right now, because of this virus situation, they're giving unlimited hours of recording on Zencastr. So if you're looking to record like an audio drama or a concert or something for a podcast, Zencastr is great and it yields better sound audio-wise than Zoom. Other companies similar to Zencastr that will record your remote interviews or remote conversations are Ringer, CleanFeed, Clearcast, and Cast. My understanding about all of these others is there is a cost involved. The other way I do record phone conversations, if I have a guest or a friend or someone recording with me who doesn't feel comfortable using the software, I can connect my phone to that little box recorder that I showed you earlier, and I can record an interview that way. It doesn't yield great sound, but it's good enough. I'm not going to get into a whole lot about remote interviews and recording remotely, but I did want to put this out there for you guys. I have started recording some interviews on Zoom due to this virus that we're dealing with now, and I haven't been able to go to people's places. Zoom yields some decent audio, but Zencastr is my go-to if I really want decent audio. I have some sound clips I was going to share with you so you could hear some of the differences. I may skip these for now so we can move on, but just my feeling is about podcast listeners. Podcast listeners are a fickle bunch. If they can't hear you well, they will tune out. So what's going to differentiate your podcast from amateur to professional type of podcast is how you record the sound. So really think about how you're recording very carefully. There have been a few podcast interviews I've done. I interviewed Kristen Chenoweth. At the time, I didn't have a podcast, so I just recorded it just so I could hear.
Really what we wanted to do was just write something that was true to our experience. Really.
I don't know what's happening. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. We're getting sound. Anyway, sorry about that, guys. But anyway, I will share some clips with you. The reason I like Zencastr, and this, I'm glad that, I guess it's good that clip went out. What I was saying about Kristen Chenoweth is I recorded that phone call with her, not for podcast purposes. And then 6 months later or a year later, she gave me permission to share that interview on my podcast, which was lovely. But because I hadn't thought about recording it for a podcast, the sound is terrible. So I did transcribe that podcast for people. So if you are having sound issues or someone is difficult to hear or understand, you may want to transcribe the podcast. There are tons of transcriptionists out there who will charge you any amount of money. It varies so much, transcriptionists and how much they charge.
What is most important to me?
The software I use is I'm going to get off the screen because these sound clips keep what's most important to me with the
write something that was true to our experience.
All right, hang on, guys.
I think really what
Again, my folks and
Really,
how
I
it's
think
raised.
everyone really has always wanted to know
Okay.
what is it.
Sorry, guys, bear with me. Anyway, the purpose of me having these sound clips is I was going to share with you some of these sound clips, and clearly that's not working very well. But if you have audio problems, I would suggest transcription. I use a software online program called Temi, TEMI.com. I send them, I upload the audio to them. They send me back usually within 10 minutes a transcription. I would say their transcription service is about 85% accurate. So I do have to listen to it and go back and correct certain words, but that's how to overcome some of the sound issues. So are there any questions about sound? Corey, I'm going to open it up to you, or sound or recording. We're going to get into editing next. So don't ask me editing questions yet. Steve is sharing that there's an excellent transcription software by Otto, O-T-T-O. It's an app, and it's been a tremendous asset to him in quick turnaround. So that's another one. So Temi or Otto, or there are transcriptionists out there, but they tend to be more expensive than some of these apps. All right. You've recorded your podcast And now we're going to get into the post-production. And this is where the largest amount of time is going to be spent on your podcast. According to Audacity, which is the software I use, and I'm going to talk about software in a second, for every 1 minute of audio that you plan to broadcast or drop on your podcast, it takes about 4 minutes of work. So it could take 4 to 5 hours just to edit a simple podcast. My 30-minute podcast takes anywhere from 5 to 10 to 20 hours sometimes to produce per week. So this is where the time comes in, is in this post-production process. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of your podcast. Everything we just talked about in the first section is about recording that main content. So whether you're recording a remote interview, you're recording your artist statement, you're recording a conversation with another person, that's the main content of your podcast. However, when setting up your podcast and editing it and piecing it together, you may have some sort of pre-roll. Pre-roll is sometimes it's an ad, sometimes it's a brief introduction about what this episode is going to be. Occasionally I have introduction music, so I have intro music I play with a voiceover introducing my podcast. You'll have some sort of spoken intro. The spoken intro to my podcast is recorded usually at my house after I've recorded the main content. Then I have my main content, which is my interview. Some people who do advertising on their podcasts will have mid-roll. Mid-roll is kind of placement for an ad, and depending on where you're placing ads in the podcast structure, depends on how much you can charge. At the end of my podcast, I usually have a little sign-off where I say, thank you for listening. I give my website, I give my social media handles, and then I put in some outro music. All of these pieces are pieced together during the post-production process. When it comes to editing, there's a lot of free software out there. If you have a Mac or an Apple device, you probably have GarageBand already installed. A lot of people use GarageBand. I know Artist Soapbox uses GarageBand to edit their podcast. Audacity is a free software program. It's online freeware, I think it's called, but it's a free program you can download online. There's tons of tutorials on Audacity. There's also tons of plugins for Audacity. There's a lot of YouTube videos on how to use it. So I do use Audacity and I like it very much. And then a lot of people use Adobe Audition to do their editing. I think, again, what's going to separate you from your podcast counterparts, what's going to separate the amateur to professional podcasts, is in the audio recording and in the editing. And I'm going to...
horror movies.
Okay. Once you've edited, you've used any of these software programs to put your podcast together and it sounds how you want it to sound. And there's a lot of companies, I guess I should say, that will edit your podcast for you, even if you have the funds or the budget to have somebody else edit. I know there's a company in town called Earfluence. They do editing services for podcasts. I've used an online provider called Music Radio Creative. They've done some editing for me. Even if you're going to outsource your editing, I would edit a few of your podcasts yourself just to kind of get the sound that you want before you start outsourcing it. That way you have a little bit of control. When you save your podcast, so now you're done. You've done your editing, you've done your recording, you put all these pieces together, you've got your music in at the beginning, you got your music in at the end. You're going to want to program in ID 3 tags, and this is how directories like Apple, Spotify, Pandora, this is the information they need to list your podcast and make that end user experience user friendly. When I save my file, my finished file in Audacity, I get a screen that looks like this, which is basically my meta tags. So these are the ID 3 tags that Apple needs. There's also, if you don't have Audacity and you don't get a screen like this, there's other software programs you can download that will put those tags or embed those tags that you need into your files. The other thing that you need post-editing, if you haven't done it already, is you need cover art. Remember, we talked about the cover art at the beginning. You will not get listed in a directory, Apple, Spotify, Pandora, any of them, if you don't have cover art that meets Apple's specification. Apple's the largest directory in the world, so everybody just defaults to their specifications. That is what my podcast cover art looks like. Pretty simple. With the ID3 V2 tags, this is the meta tags that you need to encode or embed into that music file or audio file. You at the very least want your title. What is the episode title? What is your name, being the host? You'll see a tag that says album. That is your podcast name. You'll see the year of your podcast and the genre of your podcast. The genre is your podcast category. Apple Directory has podcast categories, and they've just changed them last summer. So if you had a podcast 2 or 3 years ago, the podcast categories are different now. So check out the Apple Directory to see what the podcast categories are so you can list your podcast accordingly. Somebody is saying that they're not seeing the meta tags. Is everybody, I guess, Corey, I'm going to refer to you. Can everyone see what I'm talking about? The post-production ID 3 tags. That's what the slide says at the top. Danielle is saying no, she can't see it. Some people are saying yes. Danielle, you also have in the handout, you have on page, it says slide 17 of your handout. So I'm not actually sure what the page number is, but on slide 17 of your handout, you have these 2 slides, slide 17, slide 18, which covers the meta tags.
We'll be sending the slides out to everybody after the presentation as well. So you'll have that information there.
Okay, so because we just got real techie on the editing stuff, I'm going to kind of stop here for a second, Corey, and ask folks if they have questions before we get into episode notes, which is the last piece of the post-production section.
No questions that I see coming up right now, but I just I know that when I was searching for audio editing software, a lot of the times the term that's used is digital audio workspace, or DAW, and so that's also a term used when looking for software to edit audio as well.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about episode notes. So when you download, when you encode or embed those meta tags, those ID3 V2 tags into your audio file, that gives Apple and Spotify, Pandora, all the directories, the information they need to list your podcast. What it does not do for you is it does not, it's not search engine optimization friendly. And so you create episode notes typically on your website so that your podcast automatically becomes search engine optimization friendly, SEO friendly. Your episode notes are going to have your episode title. On this particular episode that I'm looking at on this slide, this was my episode 31. So on the episode notes on my website, it says episode 31, Jason Robert Brown, blah, 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 blah. Apple doesn't want to see episode numbers in your episode title. So typically, the software that you're using or your podcast host that you're using will take the episode number out when you list it in the directories. And then Apple generates automatically the episode number. For your website, and if you're going to have a podcast, eventually you're going to need your website. You're going to need a website. You're going to have the episode numbers. The media player that sits on your website is generated by your podcast host. We're going to talk about that in a second. I usually have a summary of what the episode's about. I have a little bio about my guest, and then I have my social media handles and links at the bottom of my episode notes so people can find my website if they're looking at these notes on Apple Podcasts. Okay, so you've done the work. Your podcast is done. You've saved your finished episode. You've created beautiful episode notes, and now you are ready to publish it. As artists, as visual artists, a lot of us already have websites. However, you cannot host your podcast typically on your website. Audio files take up a lot of space. And typically your website host, although you can upload small audio files, they don't want 63 30-minute podcast episodes uploaded to their hosting server. So typically you need a separate podcast host to store those files with you or for you. Podcast hosts have gotten very smart. And so generally, whoever your website host is has some sort of plugin that will make the podcasting host audio files seamless. What that means is I have my RDU on Stage website. My audio host, my podcast, and that my website is hosted on WordPress. Everything is done through WordPress, the RDU on Stage website. My podcast host is Captivate. Captivate.fm is the one I use. That's the one I like, but you could use Buzzsprout. You could use any podcast host. You can use Anchor. They're the ones who store my audio files. They have a plugin that plugs into my WordPress website. So people looking at my podcast on my website, it looks like it's all one and the same website, even though it's not, even though the podcast host is somewhere else. So find a podcast host that integrates with whoever your website host is. Don't try to start uploading a bunch of audio files on your website directly, because your website host may may disconnect you. It's probably not in your website agreement or your hosting agreement with your website provider that you can upload these giant audio files. So website host is something like WordPress. Podcast host is something like Anchor. If you look at your handout, on the very last page of your handout, you have a whole list of podcast hosts. There's podcast hosting services like Anchor and SoundCloud that are free. Eventually, you will probably want to pay for podcast hosting because your podcast, the free versions of the podcast hosting are fairly limited. So if you're going to podcast for a long time, you want your podcast to live on Apple Podcasts for a long time. You don't want those podcasts to be archived after 30 or 60 days. You want them to be saved forever. Then you're going to probably have to pay for service, and payment per month for podcast hosting can range anywhere from $5 to an average of $20 a month, up to $99 a month if you've got multiple podcasts that you're hosting. But I would say the average is around $10 to $20 a month for podcast hosting. iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, those are podcast directories. They are not your podcast hosts. Think of them like a Yellow Pages for your podcast. They only list your podcast. They don't do much else for you other than give you a listing in their directory. When you are ready to upload your podcast to a directory, start with Apple Podcasts first. It takes about 2 weeks to get your podcast listed on Apple Podcasts. So start with them first. None of these podcast directories will promote your podcast for you. Very few podcasts end up on the new and notable list for Apple Podcasts. So you generally have to do all of your own podcast promotion. And this is where social media comes in. For every podcast episode I do, I typically put out 3 different promos per week for that episode. One is generally a pull quote from the podcast episode itself. I use Canva to generate these pretty pictures. Canva is a free online website where you can generate these type of pretty quote boxes. There is another free online program called Headliner. I use Headliner to create audio clips of my podcast. So I'll do like a 1-minute audio clip from this week's episode, and I will put it out on Instagram or Facebook to give people a little bit of a teaser. Audiogram will generate this nice little waveform at the bottom. They'll also transcribe the audio clip. So audiograms are a really good way of promoting your podcast. If you keep them a minute or less in time, you can get them out on Instagram, which is a great way to promote your podcast.
Can we talk about how Prince
And here's kind of what the audiogram looks like with the waveform.
who you are as an artist?
I don't think the musical theater, the way we know it, would exist.
Okay. Video. There's a lot of people who are using YouTube to promote their podcasts. Now people are using TikTok to promote their podcasts using those Headliner audiograms with the waveforms. They're putting them out on TikTok. I'm starting to see that more and more. As a podcast host, because I don't typically have someone with me to video a podcast episode, it's very hard to run video and run audio and produce your podcast. It's hard to do that all at the same time. Occasionally I have a person with me though who will run a video camera, and I will put those out on Facebook or YouTube. And it is an excellent way to generate interest in your podcast. Right now we're all using Zoom meetings, and I'm doing a lot of Zoom interviews, and I'm publishing those on YouTube. My YouTube traffic from my Are You On Stage YouTube page, since I've started using Zoom and publishing those recordings or those videos on YouTube, has gone up significantly. So YouTube is a great tool, but you need to typically have somebody else to do the video part for you. Nobody's making money podcasting. I hate to break the news to you, but it's really not a big money maker. How I view podcasting, and the only way it really makes sense to me, is if it's part of your overall marketing, branding, or content strategy. We're all trying to produce content and keep our name in front of our customers. Even if you're a visual artist, you're trying to keep your name and your brand and your work in front of your customers. And if you're using podcasts to kind of do that, that's great. However, the money part is probably not going to come from podcasting itself. Before you jump into any kind of monetizing, and it's hit or miss on the monetizing, but you're going to have to know your analytics. There are different ways to capture how many people are listening to your podcast per week. Chartable, PodTrack, those are external websites that will track your podcast statistics. Your podcast host, Castos, Anchor, Blueberry, Mind, Captivate, they all give me statistics week to week, who's listening, how they're listening. Are they listening on their mobile devices? Are they listening on their computers? Are they listening on an iOS platform? Are they listening on a Windows platform? There's all sorts of data you can get to know who's listening. This graph, this chart on the slide comes from a combination of Chartable, which is free, and Apple Podcasts, which is iConnect, or iTunes Connect, gives you some of this data. So if you are a data-driven person, you can figure out how much time are people listening, how many people are subscribed. 66% of the people who listen to me every week are actually subscribed to the podcast. Are they men? Are they women? Where are they listening? Occasionally, I did an episode, and for that week I was trending on Apple Podcasts in Australia, because that particular show I was talking about was actually going to celebrate its 25th anniversary in Australia this summer. So for a short time we were trending in Australia on Apple Podcasts. So there's all sorts of data you can get. Once you have the data, you can start looking at advertising and monetizing. Some podcasts use Patreon pages. There's a lot of podcasters right now using Patreon pages. So they put bonus episodes or bonus audio footage behind a paywall for subscribers. At Are You On Stage, we give some subscribers swag. So if you have merchandise, you can give subscribers. That's incentive for people to subscribe to your Patreon page. I was very, Little Known Facts is a huge theater podcast, and I was very surprised that this particular podcaster, she just has a PayPal button on her website that says, donate to my podcast. So it can be as simple as that. As far as monetizing, a podcaster I like very much, Laura Haywood, she has people subscribe to her podcast. So it's free, but if you want to listen to it before the free version drops, then you can get early access to her podcast by subscribing, and I think it's like $6 a month. So Patreon pages, PayPal pages, subscription models, those are all ways that people are dabbling in monetizing their podcast. As far as getting advertisers for your podcast, you can go out in the community and find advertisers yourself. So for us at RDU on Stage, we are looking to solicit advertisers, restaurants, hotels, businesses around the theaters that we're talking about. We have not been successful yet, but that's what our model is going to look like. You can find sponsors through your podcast host. So if you are hosting, if you are using Anchor, for example, Anchor has a program where they will connect you to advertisers. So they will find advertisers or sponsors who are looking to advertise on a program like yours, and they will generate advertisements for you. And then you make a small fee, and by small fee, you might make $5, $10, $20 an episode. So it's not a whole lot of money. And then what we're seeing a lot of now are these advertising platforms and podcast networks that are popping up all over the place. A lot of people have asked me about joining a network. And what I will say about podcast networks, what they're doing is they are setting up a network of similar podcasts, basically a directory of similar podcasts, and then selling advertising on all of those podcasts to pool listeners. So the Broadway Podcast Network, for example, they took all these theater podcasts, they put them under the Broadway Podcast Network umbrella, and now instead of selling advertising to one podcast, they can go out and solicit advertisers for 25 podcasts or 50 podcasts, however many podcasts are on those networks. The problem with networks is that they have contracts. So they may limit what kind of content you put out. They may limit where the ads get placed. So you may not have control of where the ad placement is in your podcast. And they have very strict requirements as far as how many listeners you need to have. So Midroll is a huge podcast network that a lot of people would like to be a part of, but unless you have 30,000 downloads for your podcast, they won't even talk to you. So a lot of these networks, especially the ones worth being part of, have pretty cost prohibitive or pretty prohibitive requirements to be a part of them. It's hard to join a network, and it's hard to join a platform that makes sense. One idea I had, and maybe I can pursue it with Triangle Artworks, is to create a Triangle network of podcasts and see if that would be helpful for people. So I'll talk to Triangle Artworks more about that, and we can see if we can make that happen. But generally, the big networks are going to be pretty prohibitive until you build up a big listener base. A lot of people sell merchandise. I did print up some merchandise. I made some mugs and I made some t-shirts, and I was surprised anybody wanted them, but people really like to have a community. The podcast listeners are all about community. And so if you can design some cool merch that brings together your community, people will be all about it. So here are some companies, some you probably know as artists, Zazzle, Cafe Press. I know there's a lot of artists making products using their artwork, using Zazzle and Cafe Press. Another one is TeePublic. Sticker Mule is one where I've gotten some very inexpensive stickers for my podcast. Podcast Merch is another website. So these are all resources if you decide to jump into the merchandise bandwagon. And the other way to make money that I've seen, the other model, is to host live events. We talked about Art Curious at the beginning. I know they did some events with Alamo Drafthouse. And so that's one way to do like a local event. There are some huge podcasts that travel all over the country recording their podcasts. Pod Save America, my favorite murder. They're filling up auditoriums and theater venues because their podcasts are so popular. So doing some sort of event around your podcast could be a way to generate income. But generally, don't think of podcasting as a money or revenue generator. Think of it as a way to expand your brand, keep your name in front of your listeners. Think of it like an audio artist statement. Think of it as a way to connect with your audience or with your customers between craft shows. When I was a visual artist, I had, seasons for my craft shows, and then there would be months where I wouldn't have a craft show, usually in the winter. So if you have months and months where you're not doing craft shows or you're not in front of your customers, podcasting is a great way to keep yourself in front of your customers. iTunes and Amazon also has affiliate links. So if you're selling anything on your podcast, occasionally I'll have an author on my podcast. And if they want to sell their book, or I want to put a link to their book in my episode notes, I do have an Amazon affiliate account where if somebody clicks that link and buys something, I get a few cents. But again, it's not a moneymaker, podcasting. Okay, so what other questions do you have? That's the presentation. Make it part of your overall marketing plan. What other questions do you have for me as we kind of approach our last couple minutes here? I feel like this last part of the podcast, I just spewed out a lot of stuff at you. But Corey's going to make the slide presentation available on the on Triangle Artworks, and then this whole presentation will be on Artswell TV, so you'll be able to rewatch it. And then you have a lot of the links that I mentioned in your handout on the last pages. You've got tons of links.
Yes, we don't have a question, but we do have a comment saying that this was wonderful and thank you for all of the good information from Jessica.
Thank you. And please reach out to me. I would ask everybody to follow me on social media at RDU on Stage, either on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And you can message me through any of those platforms, or visit the RDU on Stage website, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. People were very good to me when I started podcasting and answering questions and helping me, and I'll be happy to help anybody, especially the artists community, because those are my people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for this informative presentation. That took a long time to speak out. Thank you guys again for attending. Things will be available online. You will be getting an email about a survey. We'd love to hear your feedback on what we're doing right and what we can improve upon. So please fill that out. It should only take a minute or so to do. Other than that, check out RDU on Stage, rduonstage.com, right? Is that right?
Yeah, rduonstage.com, or on social media at RDU on Stage. We're hosting virtual events every day now through this COVID-19 epidemic. So you can join us for any of our virtual events as well.
Awesome. And don't forget to check out Artswell TV as well on YouTube, where this webinar, along with tutorials and artists speaking about different ways they're coping with the self-isolation and this new reality. And yeah, thank you again. And you guys have a wonderful day. And hope to talk to you all sometime soon.
Thank you guys. Thanks for hosting me.
Oh, you are our pleasure. Thank you guys so much. Bye.
Thank you.